So clearly, the argument between the oppressor versus the oppressed has been settled, so we can move past that. Today's October 31st, 2015, Halloween. Happy Halloween. Let's see, I want to say 69, October 31st, 1969. Let's set the scene. It's a Friday under the sign of Scorpio. So, today's Saturday, so it's a weekend. The U.S. president was Richard Nixon. And that special week of October, people in the U.S. were listening to Suspicious Minds by Elvis Presley. In UK, I'll Never Fall in Love Again by Bobby Gentry was in the top 5 hits. Marlowe, directed by Paul Bogart, was one of the most viewed movies released in 1969, while The Love Machine by Jacqueline Susan was one of the best-selling books. So that's some things that happened on October 31st, 1969. There was also a race riot that happened in Jacksonville, Florida. On October 31st, 1969, bullets became the matches that ignited Jacksonville's east side. A white cigarette salesman, convinced that a black youth he saw near his parked truck was stealing from it, rushed out of a Florida Avenue grocery store to confront him with his gun, a .44 caliber Magnum revolver. Blazing, he shot the youth twice, hitting him once in the leg. But the salesman's overreaction touched all 3 days of mayhem. Blacks, mostly young, impoverished, and looking to lash out at any symbols of white authority that they associated with their oppression, rampaged. According to the Times-Union, 2 trucks were overturned as a crowd of around 300 tore down the street. Furniture and grocery stores were burned and looted. A number of people were injured by gunshots, and property damages escalated into the hundreds of thousands. Today, the riot-stricken stores along Florida Avenue, now A. Philip Randolph Boulevard, are gone. The street is wider, and city-owned buildings, parks, and churches coexist with smaller stores and businesses. During the fall, the area teams of people who park there on their trek to the Jacksonville Jaguars games, yet the east side is still north of the state. Okay, so that happened, right? That happened. The riot happened because a white salesman shot a black youth he thought was stealing from him. We don't know what the truth is. The other guy is dead, unfortunately, and race riot was, a reaction to that. 1969. Also, October 31st, I read just 21,000 people in 1918 had died in 1 week. 21,000. The Spanish flu, the H1N1, it's wild. Okay, there's one of the biggest pandemics. People had died, and then they say there's a conspiracy of silence. The important and almost incomprehensible fact about the Spanish influenza is that it killed millions upon millions of people in a year or less. Nothing else, no infection, no war, no famine has ever killed so many in as short a period. And yet it never inspired awe, not in 1918 and not since. So Wikipedia had actually said that it was the second H1N1 flu pandemic. We started to see that rise again just shortly. Epidemic diseases have often changed the course of human history. The death of a world leader, an epidemic before a great battle, but few diseases have accomplished it through sheer brute force. The deadliest epidemic of all times wasn't smallpox or the Black Death, the bubonic plague. It was the 1918 flu. An estimated 50 to 100 million people died out of the global population of 1.8 billion. In America alone, 675,000 people died. More Americans died of the flu in a single year than in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. It was one of the great watershed events in the history of the world, yet it's remained shrouded in a cloud of silence ever since. Usual explanation is that World War I took center stage. But it's also true that flu survivors were so horrified they didn't want to remember. During one of the most productive periods in American literature, there's only very few mentions of the flu. So, the flu, where did this flu come from, right? Why is there this huge flu that nobody's talking about? The hypothesis about the source I'm going to get to in a second here. So, according to Wikipedia, it's unusually deadly influenza pandemic, the first of the two pandemics involving the H1N1 influenza virus. The reason why they call it the Spanish flu, World War I was happening, and the Spanish king had contacted it. So the King Alfonso XIII, he was a neutral country, so of course, you know, they put it on the neutral country, called it the Spanish flu, but it has nothing to do, you know, didn't come out of Spain, they didn't create it, it didn't have, the center of it actually was in France, or maybe Kansas. So it infected 500 million people across the world, including remote Pacific islands in the Arctic, killed 50 to 100 million people, 3 to 5% of the world's population, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history. Most influenza outbreaks disproportionately kill juvenile, elderly, or already weakened patients. In contrast, the 1918 pandemic predominantly killed previously healthy young adults. Modern research using virus taken from the bodies of frozen victims have concluded that the virus kills through a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the body's immune system. The strong immune reactions of young adults ravage the body, whereas the weaker immune systems of children and middle-aged adults resulted in fewer deaths among those groups. Historical and epidemiological data are inadequate to identify the pandemic's geographic origin. It was implicated in the outbreak of encephalitis lethargica in the 1920s. To maintain morale, wartime censors minimized early reports of the illness and mortality in Germany, Britain, France, and U.S., but papers were free to report the epidemic's effects in neutral Spain, such as the grave illness of King Alfonso XIII, creating a false impression of Spain as especially hard hit, thus the pandemic's nickname Spanish flu. That's where the name comes from. In Spain, a different nickname was adopted, the Naples Soldier, which came from musical operetta Zarzuela titled La Canción del Olvido, the Song of Forgetting. The Naples Soldier. The operetta premiered in Madrid during the first epidemic wave, and Federico Romero, one of the liberal librettists, quipped that the play's most popular musical number, Naples Soldier, was as catchy as the flu. So the Naples Soldier. Hypothesis about the source, investigative work by a British team led by virologist John Oxford of St. Bartholomew's Hospital and the Royal London Hospital, identified a major troop staging and hospital camp in Etaples, France, as almost certainly being the center of the 1918 flu pandemic. A significant precursor virus was harbored in birds and mutated to pigs that were kept near the front. Early hypotheses of the pandemic's origin have varied. Some hypotheses the flu originated in the Far East. Dr. C. Hanaum, leading expert of the 1918 flu for the Institut Pasteur, asserted the former virus was likely to have come from China, mutated in the United States near Boston, and spread to Brest, France, Europe's battlefields, Europe, and the world using Allied soldiers and sailors as main spreaders. Hanaum considered several other hypotheses of origin, such as Spain, Kansas, and Brest as being possible but not likely. Historian Alfred W. Crosby speculated the flu originated in Kansas. Popular writer John Barry echoed Crosby in describing Haskell County, Kansas, as the likely point of origin. Haskell County. Political scientist Andrew Price Smith published data from the Austrian archives suggesting the influenza had earlier origins beginning in Austria in the spring of 1917. Historian Mark Humphreys of Canada's Memorial University of Newfoundland states that newly unearthed records confirm that one of the side stories of the world, the mobilization of 96,000 Chinese laborers to work behind the British and French lines in the World War I's Western Front, may have been the source of the pandemic. In the new report, Humphreys finds archival evidence that a respiratory illness that struck northern China in November 1917 was identified a year later by Chinese health officials as identical to the Spanish flu. So we don't know. We don't know where the flu actually came from. All we have is hypothesis, like 3 or 4 hypotheses. You know, they censored the information about it intentionally. They didn't want anybody knowing about it. It hit Kentucky specifically. Kentucky saw its first cases of influenza during the last week of September 1918. Infected troops traveling on the Louisville-Nashville Railroad stopped off in Bowling Green, where they passed the virus onto a few of the local citizens. By the time the first week ended, Louisville had already suffered an estimated 1,000 cases of influenza. September 1918. The pandemic grew even worse in ensuing weeks. Louisville alone lost 180 people each week from influenza during the second and third weeks after it struck. On October 6th, the Kentucky State Board of Health announced the closing of all places of amusement, schools, churches, and other places of assembly. So the government shut everything down. Because they were almost certainly simply overwhelmed with combating the disease, Kentucky officials did not even report influenza cases to the U.S. Public Health Service until late October. At that point, state officials reported more than 5,000 cases of the flu, and over the next 3 weeks, they reported over 8,000 more. The state was never able to reliably report the deaths that resulted from the flu in Kentucky, but accounts from residents at the time paint a grim picture. For instance, in Pike County, Kentucky, a miner named Teamus Bartley called the epidemic the saddest looking time than that you ever saw in your life. He and his brother worked at a coal mine when his brother's entire family came down with the disease. Teamus visited his brother every night, reported on what he saw. Nearly every porch that I looked at would have a casket box sitting on it, and men are digging graves just as hard as they could, and the mines had to shut down. There wasn't an area a man there wasn't a mine or running a lump of coal or working or running no work. Stayed that way for about 6 weeks. Teamus later said that each night he saw 4 or 5 miners and family members die in the camps. Even as late as mid-December 1918, Kentucky was so overwhelmed by disease that a local health officer sent an urgent telegram to Surgeon General Rupert Blue, requesting that the U.S. Public Health Service take over the administration of health work until the influenza epidemic had abated. When it comes to pandemics, there's no rational basis to believe that the early years of the 21st century will be different than the past. If a pandemic strikes, it will come to Kentucky. So, that's the thing. There's a saying about history. Those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it, but historians are, sort of cursed because they don't have anybody listening to them, so they get to watch history repeat itself over and over again. They should be more involved, I think. They shouldn't just let shit, go to hell. What the fuck? So those are some things that happened on October 31st, 1918 Spanish flu. Killed a lot of people, definitely on October 31st as well as every other day. But that race riot had happened in 1969 over a most likely racist murder. And 44 Magnum, though, it did make me think of Clint Eastwood, and then it makes me think of Gran Torino. If the guy was breaking into your vehicle, I personally, it's not justice. Someone takes something from you and you take their life. That's not justice. But property is one of the cornerstones of America. We're a capitalist society. If it wasn't for private property, owning pieces of land and building whatever it is we want on that land, having complete dominion over that land, that's the cornerstone of what our capitalist society is about. And I can't say that murder is just for stealing. But if you don't catch them and you can't try them or find them or jail them, it feels like, I guess I sort of like it because if you can't capture them, then you won't be able to get justice. At the very least, they should give you your stuff back, if not be punished even farther. Those who take, there should be a punishment for it. Rand Paul talked about drone strikes. Taking drones and just, if someone steals $50 worth of liquor or something, then a drone can just, strike them, like a police drone or something. So, that's typically the protection of property is the state's responsibility. And anytime a business or a corporation or a bank, is robbed, the police are always there. If you're robbed, it's not always, certain if you'll actually get any of your stuff back. If they'll even take it serious. Oh, you're like a citizen, you don't own a business, you're just like a guy. I don't know, guy. Maybe you deserve to get your shit stolen. So, I would like to actually look at the origins of that story a little bit closer, because if the guy was robbing, then he's not technically justified killing him, but to do something, and so then the riot would almost seem as if anything was needed to sort of spark, you know, a riot, any type of event like that that had racist implications. So, you know, usually race riots, when I think of race riots, it's white people attacking black people. That's what the race riots in the right after the Civil War was about. White people just going to black communities and just, you know, causing havoc, scorched earth campaign, just doing whatever damage they want to. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, they was even bombing. They was taking planes and dropping bombs on Tulsa, just because it was after World War I. White people fought in World War I, and once you fought for other people's freedom with a gun out in the field, you start to think that you should be free too, and that scared the white residents of Tulsa. So this isn't like that. This is just almost, I wouldn't say the opposite. I don't know if they just burned down white businesses or any businesses. There's a couple other things that actually happened I want to get to. The dissolution of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. I'll end it off on this. The Lansing Note was in effect the death certificate of Austria-Hungary. The national councils had already begun acting more or less as provisional governments of independent countries, with defeat in the war imminent after the Italian offensive in the Battle of Rio Veneto on October 24th. The Czech politicians peacefully took over command in Prague on October 28th, later declared the birthday of Czechoslovakia, and followed up in other major cities in the next few days. On October 30th, the Slovaks followed in Martin. On the 29th of October, the Slavs in both portions of what remained of Austria-Hungary proclaimed the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. They also declared their ultimate intention was to unite with Serbia and Montenegro in a large South Slav state. On the same day, the Czechs and Slovaks formally proclaimed the establishment of Czechoslovakia as an independent state. Charles, last Hungarian Prime Minister, Mihály Károlyi, terminated the personal union with Austria on October 31st, officially dissolving the Austro-Hungarian state. By the end of October, there's nothing left of the Habsburg realm, but its majority German, Danubian, and Alpine provinces, and Charles' authority was being challenged even there by the German-Austrian State Council. So, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire dissolved and was no more. President Johnson ordered the stop of bombings right at the end of his 4-year term before he said he didn't want the nomination of the Democratic Party, which actually left a vacuum, and then Nixon gets in there. So, but he did actually admit that Vietnam, he started to scale back and said no more bombing. So, and that had an effect on future generations, because everybody knew that they were trying to get out of Vietnam some way, somehow. So he put a stop to the air raids on North Vietnam. The Operation Rolling Thunder, he put a stop to that October 31st, 1968, right before the election, right? October 31st, the election day is the 3rd, on Tuesday. So President Johnson did that. The Algerian War started on October 31st, and then the Mountjoy prison helicopter escaped when 3 provisional Irish Republican Army volunteers escaped from Mountjoy prison in Dublin, Ireland, aboard a hijacked Alouette 2 helicopter, which briefly landed in the prison's exercise yard. The escape made headlines around the world and was an embarrassment to the Irish coalition government of the time, led by Fine Gael's Liam Cosgrave, which was criticized by opposition party Fianna Fáil. Manhunt involving 20,000 members of the Irish Defence Forces in Garda Síochána was launched for the escapees, one of whom, Seamus Twomey, was not recaptured until December 1977. The Wolf Tones wrote a song celebrating the escape called the Helicopter Song, which topped the Irish popular music charts despite being banned by the government. The song isn't even that good, but the fact that they banned the song, why would they ban a song that isn't really that good? The political implications to turn these guys into heroes, you don't want to do that. The Provisional Irish Republican Army, the Algerian War, it started, the Algerian War was 7 years long between France. The Algerian independence movement led to Algeria gaining its independence from France. An important decolonization war is a complex conflict characterized by guerrilla warfare, maquis fighting terrorism, the use of torture by both sides, and counter-terrorism operations. The conflict was a civil war There was also a civil war by loyalist Algerians supporting a French Algeria and their insurrectionist Algerian national counterparts. So, Toussaint Rouge is what the event was called, and I guess actually also known as, a Bloody All Saints Day is the name given to the series of attacks that took place on November 1st, 1954. So it's actually tomorrow, the Catholic Festival of All Saints Day in French Algeria is usually taken as the starting date for the Algerian War, which lasted until 1962. And led to Algerian independence from France. Between midnight and 2 a.m. on the morning of All Saints Day, 30 individual attacks were made by FLN militants against police and military targets around French Algeria. 7 people were killed in the attack, all except 2 were French colonists. And then that starts the war, the Toussaint Rouge. So after the Toussaint Rouge, 7 years of fighting happens, and then Algeria, one of the largest countries, it's right next to Spain in Africa. It's an African country, one of the largest ones, became its own country, became free. 7 years. So they fought their colonial masters just like the Americans fought their colonial masters. In the American Revolution, the Algerians had the exact same thing. Their revolution, their independence was against the French Empire. And eventually, 1962, they got their freedom. Yay. October 31st, historical events.